Hi friends! Improving our listening abilities in a foreign language can be one of the more harder parts when studying a new language, but of course it's also very necessary for communication and stuff, so it's really worthwhile investing your time into. But to make it fun and enjoyable in the long term, it's quite important to change up your study methods now and then. So today I will introduce you to all the methods I know, at least, how you can study a foreign language with podcasts. And because my channel is mainly about Japanese, I will of course talk mostly about Japanese, but of course you can use all the methods I'm mentioning for every language you want to learn. All of you probably know active listening and passive listening, so I won't talk a lot about that, but essentially passive listening is if you listen to podcasts while doing other stuff and you don't really focus on every single word the person in the podcast says, and you're just trying to grasp the whole picture of the podcast. And active listening, on the other hand, you definitely focus on every single word the podcast host is saying and trying to understand hopefully everything. Passive listening, for example, helped me quite a lot to understand podcasts better, because at first I didn't really understand a lot of what I was hearing, so I just had it on in the background or when I was commuting or riding my bike, and slowly I became better at understanding the podcast contents. And I think after 40 or 50 very short episodes, I was able to finally understand one episode fully. So it definitely takes a long time when you choose passive listening, but it can be a little bit easier, especially if you get overwhelmed at first by all the new words, because you don't have to stress so much about understanding everything. And active listening, on the other hand, definitely yields results more quickly, at least in my opinion, on my experience. And if you have a transcript for the podcast, then it's even better, because you can see what you didn't understand and look up the words that were unknown for you. One thing you can also do with active listening is to increase the speed of your podcast, because if it becomes too easy, you can just try to listen to it faster and also improve the speed of your listening comprehension that way. Another study method you can use is shadowing. And with shadowing, the goal is to mimic how the podcast host is speaking, especially the rhythm and the pronunciation, to just get a better feel for how the language is actually used and how to sound more native-like. And there are, for example, two ways how you can use shadowing. So for example, classic shadowing, you will simultaneously try to speak alongside the person who is narrating the podcast. But of course, this can be very hard, especially if you don't know the episode very well and you aren't as familiar with the language yet. But the method I prefer is delayed shadowing, because there you listen to one sentence and then you press pause and then you repeat the sentence. So you have more time to process the information you are getting and also more time to repeat it for yourself without being distracted, because the podcast host is already onto the next sentence. I find it a bit less overwhelming and less stressful. And it's also easier for beginners and also for more complex sentences. And if you want something more challenging and also have a little bit more time on your hands, then you can also try one of the more intensive methods. The first method is the interview method. And I first saw it on Robin McPherson's channel. I haven't tried it for myself, but it sounds quite fun and also a good method if you are still a bit shy to talk to real people. And you basically treat the podcast host as someone who's interviewing you. If the podcast host asks a question towards the audience, for example, then you pause the podcast and then you will give your 2 cents on what you think about the topic or what you want to say. And this can be only one sentence or maybe a whole paragraph of your own thoughts and opinions. If there's no question the podcast host makes during the podcast, you can also just pause the podcast after the podcast host has made one of their points or stated one of their opinions, and then you can give your own opinion on the topic. And that way you kind of have to free talk, but there's no pressure in someone listening. But then there's also the downside of not someone listening, because then you don't get corrected for your mistakes you will make. I think it's still a good method to try to get you into talking at first. The next method is summarizing, and this will also improve your writing skill as well. And you will first listen to the whole podcast, ideally actively, because passively I think it can be a bit tricky. And then you will summarize what the podcast is about in maybe 1 or 2 sentences, or also a couple more sentences, depending on how far in your language learning journey you are and how much time you want to invest into it. And there are 2 ways how you could do it. You could, for example, go the easy route and use the same words the podcast host used in his podcast and just describe the podcast contents, like using the words that were already used. Or you can also try to challenge yourself and use different words so that you can practice the flexibility of your expressions. The next method is transcribing, and this method has the goal of writing down everything the podcast host says. It's a very easy way to show you where your comprehension gaps are, because if you don't understand a certain word, you of course can't write it down. And after you transcribe the whole podcast, you will see all the gaps that you have. And if you have a transcript, that would be ideal. And then you can go back and see if you made any mistakes, fill in the gaps, like the words you didn't know. And for me, it was very helpful at the start of the year, where I did this almost every week, because it showed me what words I definitely still have to practice. Because sometimes when I talk to my italki tutor, I don't know what she's trying to say because I don't understand a certain word. But if she writes the word down in the chat and I see the kanji, I'm like, oh yeah, I know this word, but I just didn't recognize it without seeing the kanji and seeing how it's written. So I definitely know that I have to study this word more and get the pronunciation of the word more into my brain. And if you want to start doing this method, I would definitely recommend you to start with a very, very short episode first, because this can take quite a while, depending on how fast you can type and how often you have to pause and go back into the podcast to fill in some things you didn't catch the first time. And when I did my first episode, I think it was only like 4 minutes long or like 5 minutes long, and I think it took me an hour. So if you want to do a whole 20-minute podcast, it can take you half a day almost. So yeah, just keep this in mind and keep it short at first. And again, ideally, the podcast has a transcript you can reference afterwards to see where your mistakes were. Podcasts I like to use when doing this practice are Japanese with Shon and also Oyasumi Japanese with Shon. Those are quite short. There are some longer episodes, but also a lot of episodes that are only like 4 or 5 minutes long. And I would definitely recommend starting with those first if you are like a beginner or you haven't tried this at all. And he also has transcripts for the podcast episodes on his Patreon, which is quite cheap. I think it was like $6 a month or something. So it's definitely quite affordable. And here's one of the examples of my transcribed podcast episode. I wrote the transcribed texts into Notion and then marked the words I didn't know the spelling of in red and words that were new to me in blue. Afterwards, I made a little list with all the new words and words I still needed to practice to just keep everything in one place. Another method you can use to improve your listening abilities and also your vocabulary and grammar knowledge is translating. And I don't think I have to explain too much for this method, but of course you have to translate the podcast episode sentence by sentence. And this way you also see what you don't understand yet. And it also helps you to build your grammar and vocabulary knowledge as well, because you can see like, okay, this grammar pattern in Japanese means exactly this in German or English or something. And for me, it's very helpful because sometimes I see a grammar point when I'm reading something and I kind of know what it's trying to say, but I wouldn't really know how I could say this sentence in German. So when I'm translating it, I see, okay, this is basically the equivalent of this in German. And it definitely helps me to pick grammar more intuitively in the long term when I'm writing my own texts and stuff. So it's definitely beneficial. The last method I have for you today is discussion. You can basically write a text based on the podcast about the podcast topic and then list the arguments that speak like for the topic and the arguments that speak against the topic, and then just try to state your own opinion at the end. And this way you can definitely practice your writing as well. So if the podcast deals, for example, with homeschooling, you can list your own pros and cons and then also state your opinion at the end of the text. But of course, you can also keep it simple and only talk about your experience or your own opinion about the topic. Here's an example of a text that I wrote after listening to a podcast about studying outside of the own home. And I wrote about studying at the cafe and my struggles I had with studying outside and how I overcame them and how I grew liking and studying outside. And it was quite fun. And I was also able to use a lot of new grammar points. If you want to know how I go about writing longer texts in Japanese, then definitely subscribe, because this will be my next video that's coming out after this one. And those were all of the methods that at least I know of, how you could use podcasts for studying your target language. And of course, you don't have to use all of them, because it could be very overwhelming to try to implement everything. But based on what skill you want to improve and how far you are in your language learning process, you can pick like 2 or 3 methods and then just switch it up from time to time so it doesn't get boring. And to make the decision of what methods are good for you easier, I made a little overview that shows what method is good for improving what skill. So for example, if you want to improve your grammar knowledge and grammar usage, then translation, discussion, or transcribing would be a good idea. For spelling, transcribing would be great. When you want to improve writing, then summarizing and discussion would be good for you. And to improve your pronunciation, shadowing would be a good alternative. And if you want to improve your free talk, then maybe try the interview method. Let me know how you are currently using podcasts to study your target language and which method I mentioned today you would like to try. If you've liked this video and found it helpful, don't forget to share it with a friend, and I will see you in my next video very soon. Bye bye!